Good morning and welcome to today's session. Welcome to the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce Business Growth Series, sponsored by Cowan Insurance Group. I'm Tracy Spark, Senior Manager of our Personal Insurance and Private Client Business at Cowan. We're proud to partner with the Cambridge Chamber to provide Chamber members and their employees with preferred pricing for all their home and auto insurance needs. From now until December 31st, members can also be entered into a contest to win up to $5,000 in cash if you just request a quote on your home and auto insurance. I'm pleased today to see each of you joining us for today's topic, brutal prioritization in times of turbulence. For most of us, juggling multiple competing priorities in our work lives is a constant challenge, and it can be difficult to determine what is most important. Organizations that set small number of priorities rather than focusing on several are much more successful at achieving their goals than companies that spread themselves too thin. But how can we as business leaders determine which priorities to focus on? Today, Peter Wright, career business strategist and president of the planning group, will share the concept of brutal prioritization, teaching us how to make real change and prioritizing less, not more. Among other things, we'll learn how to differentiate between important and urgent tasks, along with seven critical tips for effective prioritization in the workplace. As a respected executive in his current consulting practice, Peter Wright has developed business plans and strategies for organizations in more than 20 countries. He works alongside his clients to create and execute planning and strategy with remarkable results, advising boards, senior leadership teams, and executives across a broad spectrum of sectors and organizations. By providing planning expertise, process advice, and facilitation, Peter helps organizations resolve operational issues, manage barriers to performance, and overcoming the planning gap. In 19 years of developing business plans, Peter has created many successful tools, models, and practices that can be taught to clients and other consultants. He is a lifelong resident of Cambridge and a proud member of the Cambridge Chamber. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Peter Wright.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm glad that was being recorded because that's probably the nicest intro I've had in a while. So might have to go back and get that recording myself. So thank you very much. It's nice to be here. I think everybody should be able to see my screen now, the brutal prioritization slide. Let me know, Caitlin, if you cannot. I'm going to start today just with a little bit of background, get us started. I've got you for 50 minutes. We're going to leave a little bit of time for questions. Don't hesitate to interrupt me as we go. We're going to have several polls throughout the webinar today just to keep you awake and keep you engaged, which Caitlin will put up on the screen on Zoom as we go throughout the presentation today. Great quote. I've got a few quotes on the slide. There's a great quote on the slide, and it's absolutely true. As Tracy was saying, if we chase too many things, it's really hard for us to accomplish any single thing. And I'm going to come back to that theme throughout the day today. I really only have a couple objectives for today's call. One is just to make the case for why prioritization is important. Might not be exactly what you think. And the other is to give you some tips to actually do prioritization better, to actually be more brutal in how you prioritize, be more successful and more productive in how you prioritize in your workplace, whether your workplace is big or small. And of course, some of these tips apply to your home life as well, because we also have to prioritize in our personal lives. I'll start with my favorite topic, which of course is all about me. More to say that I don't do a lot of training. I don't do a lot of speaking. I don't do a lot of webinars. It probably takes about 20% of my time. Most of my time is spent with clients, helping them determine where they want to be as organizations, and then the most productive and effective path to get there. Years ago, I was driving down the road with a friend and colleague, Jim Beretta, also a guy from Cambridge. And he's a guy who asks lots of questions, and he's always just trying to provoke some thought and some conversation. And he just said to me, we were driving to Windsor to see a client together, and he just said to me, is it the strategy or is it the execution? And I was going to blurt out, well, obviously it's the execution, dummy. Everybody knows that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the clearer, more specific, more tangible, more practical, more measurable we can be about our strategy, the easier it is to execute. the easier it is to prioritize. And so we're going to talk about prioritization today at multiple levels in terms of where we are in very strategic, operational, or tactical, because prioritization happens at every level of strategy and planning and every level of execution. And where we quite often fall down is at the most strategic levels of our plan, we don't provide clear enough guidance because we believe that because it's high level, it has to be vague. And then everybody downstream of that strategy trying to make their own prioritization decisions is kind of confused and kind of stuck about how to prioritize and where to prioritize. We have smart people, we have smart executors in our organizations. The trick is, without telling them how to do their job, provide enough strategic guidance so that they can be effective in their own downstream prioritization. So, if I met somebody new and they said, "What do you do for a living?" The truth is that a big part of what I do is help organizations determine how to prioritize and what those priorities are going to be. And it's not fun. One of the things that I want to point out before we get into this is don't hesitate to drop me a line. Don't hesitate to email me. Don't hesitate to call me. I love to hear from people after these sessions where they say, "I really like this and I want to go and try something, but how do I start? What do I do? Do you have some tips?" And the truth is that I'll probably say, "I've got some PowerPoint slides from a session I just did, and I'll change the name to Acme and send it to you." So don't hesitate to reach out to me. I think the first question people always ask me is, why does it need to be brutal? Why do you call it brutal prioritization? The truth is that I've been talking about prioritization for so long with clients, and I think they mostly heard me just say blah, blah, blah. They just tune me out. The minute I started calling it brutal prioritization and talked about how tough it was, my clients' ears perked up and they really started to listen about why it's so hard, but why it's so important. Making prioritization decisions, making decisions to allocate our scarce resources, and our number one scarce resource, of course, is our management attention, should hurt. And if it doesn't hurt, you're probably not really being effective in your prioritization. If people aren't a little bit upset about what we're not doing, then we're probably not being effective in our prioritization. So if it doesn't feel brutal, in my view, in a workplace setting, we're probably not prioritizing as well as we could be. And unfortunately, although I think I'm going to give you some good advice and some good tips today, and some of them are quite tangible and tactical, none of my advice today is easy. So just because I'm going to give you some tools to work with doesn't make the prioritization decisions and discussions any easier, but I hope it will give you some tools, some frameworks, some approaches, ways to reframe discussions and conversations to be more successful in prioritization. Part of the problem is we've been conditioned to believe more is better. More ice cream is always better than less ice cream. More money, some people might think, is always better than less money. But the problem is, in organizations, we start to confuse our never-ending quest with more with the fact that we can take on too many priorities. In fact, too many priorities in an organization is sometimes a horrible badge of honor. Sometimes people's worth is determined by how many priorities they have, how many projects I'm the sponsor of, how many things that I've got on my to-do list sometimes is seen as kind of a good thing. And what I want to get across today is it's not a good thing. The best strategists, the best leaders, the best managers are the people in our organizations who can sharply prioritize and brutally prioritize and get more stuff done. So the other critical thing is in organizations is, although it's sometimes a badge of honor, too many priorities just on its own, everything else being equal, can be debilitating. It can make us feel lousy to know that we've got this chain around our neck, which is literally a laundry list of things that we know we're never going to get to. Ultimately, I believe that our inability or our choice to not prioritize is really a lack of willingness for us to make difficult choices. Every choice we make when it comes to prioritization should be difficult. I like to quote people, but I quoted myself in this instance. I've done lots of webinars, I've done lots of talks, and I almost never do the Webster's dictionary thing of what the definition of something is. But in this case, I wanted to do it because the actual definition of prioritization is to treat something as more important than something else. That's why this is so darn hard. But what I'm going to talk a little bit about later is this definition in the workplace setting is only partly true. In the workplace setting, we need to understand what's important. Something is more important than something else, but we also need to decide what's urgent in the context of the current operating environment, in the context of our current strategy, in the context of what's going on around us today. Once we can help people see that everything's important, everything that we all want to do in the context of this conversation is important, but what's the most urgent and the most important and the most prominent in the context of what we're talking about today? And once we can get over that hump, we can be much more successful with prioritization. This is all, everything I'm talking about today is based on my belief that if you do less things at once, you can get more stuff done. And I've seen it, I've proven it, I've shown it time and time again. And this applies at the most strategic level of your organization and the most tactical level of your organization. The other thing that I'm going to keep coming back to today is there needs to be a powerful connection between the strategic direction that's very specific and helps downstream prioritization and the actual underlying priorities, the underlying things that we're executing at an operational and tactical level in our organizations. So on one hand, the tips that I'm talking about today can and do apply at any level. And of course, there are lots of others. But on the other hand, we need to make sure that there's a powerful connection at each of those levels. The other thing is, which I like the most, is not only can we get more things done if we do less things at once, but we can do it with less stress and less drama on an organization. So I want, if you just think about this in very tangible terms, if a company, and I'll talk about this company later, if a company has 300 projects, they're never going to get any of them or very few of them done. If they've got 25 projects, by the end of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, they're actually going to execute more project outcomes by doing less projects at once. And that's the most tangible example in organizations because almost all of our strategy execution happens through projects. Interestingly, my theory is, in the work that I've done in prioritization with clients, is based on lots of work with clients and kind of longitudinal look backs on what clients have been able to do when they focus on less things at once. For a long time, I thought that I invented this concept, but really this is a prominent theme through Lean, Kanban, Six Sigma. It's almost all based on Little's Law, and Little's Law basically says, if you want to increase your throughput, then limit your work in progress. And it works in a manufacturing setting, and of course it works in an office setting as well. All right, Caitlin, here's our first poll. The question is, I'll let Caitlin put this up on the screen on your Zoom screen. The question is, we utilize some system in our workplace today with a specific focus on prioritization. I'll let you, yes, we fully utilize the tools to assist in prioritization. We've got more black belts running around than a dojo, all the way down through, is this being recorded? All right, Caitlin, let me know when everybody's voted. All right, there we go. So yeah, nobody at the top end of things, and fortunately nobody at the is this being recorded end of things. So this is what you'd expect. We all use some mechanisms, whether they're very formal or very informal, for prioritization. So, the topic today is about taking prioritization, brutal prioritization, and applying it in this very turbulent time we find ourselves in. Not only are we pandemic, post-pandemic, but we're in most my client operating environments between human resource shortages, between the impact of the economic turmoil we're going to find ourselves in, between the impact of government austerity that we're going to find ourselves in. Most of the industries I'm working in are finding themselves differently than the past in a perfect storm of a relatively hostile operating environment, and have come through a period now of crisis, or something that looks like crisis, having their businesses turned upside down. During a time of crisis, not only being able to prioritize during the time of crisis, but having the muscle, having the tools, having the chops, having the capabilities and the readiness to be better at prioritization in a time of crisis before crisis happens is the single most important determinant of success in a time of crisis. I can tell you that the boards that I worked with who did very well, particularly early in the pandemic, are the boards that had lots of conversations about how to have tough conversations. They had lots of conversations about how to prioritize when things change. They had lots of conversations about business continuity at a strategic level, and they had lots of conversations that just helped them be more ready to have tough conversations when the time came. Those organizations did very well, and the organizations that I worked with who maybe were less ready struggled to get their feet under them in the pandemic. In a crisis, this is when leaders need to signal prioritization the most sharply to the rest of the organization. This is when people can go off in 10 different directions and think that they're doing the right thing because they don't have the specificity and strategic guidance that's required. So we need to be more visible, sharper in our prioritization, sharper in our direction during times of crisis. And I guess you've probably all seen this. Crisis mode for some of us really sharpens our prioritization, and for some of us it really dulls it. We need to make sure that we've got the tools, the skills, the readiness, and the capabilities to sharpen our prioritization when a crisis hits. All right, Caitlin, next question. We started prioritizing formally before the pandemic, true or false? And it's been amazing what this pandemic's done for organizations to bring a sharp focus to prioritization. All right, so we'll give you a minute. Yeah, so kind of 2/3, 1/3. Most of us were taking somewhat of a formal approach, but I think the pandemic has really sharpened the focus for all of us. This is a true quote. You always have time for the first thing on your list. You always have time for what you actually put first. All right, so the topic today is these kind of 7 things. What can we actually do to be more effective in our prioritization, to be more brutal in our prioritization? I won't read through these now. You can see them on the screen because I'm now going to go through them one at a time. Some of them are quite strategic, some of them are quite high level, and some of them, like the last one, are something that you could take away today and start using today to prioritize better. Consultants love matrices because they help us sharpen our thinking. They help us align our thinking around something. And matrices are good tools to use. I've got the oldest one in the book on the left, and the Kraljic matrix, which some of you may know, on the right. But you can make a matrix for anything, and I'll show you some examples where we've got prioritization decisions to make. So sometimes just to say, all right, let's get everybody in a room. We've got 20 things and we can only do 5 of them. Sometimes it's easier to say, all right, we've got a whole bunch of ideas, or a whole bunch of opportunities, or a whole bunch of ways that we're going to grow, or a whole bunch of whatever. How do we prioritize? Sometimes it just helps not to give you the answer, but to focus and facilitate the discussion to say, well, what if we put it on a scale of this to this? You know, how would that help our thinking? And I'll show you a couple things that I've done with clients in the last little while. For those of you who buy things, if you're in charge of purchasing or in charge of a supply chain in your organization, you probably already use the Kraljic matrix. This is a matrix that purchasing professionals use to essentially pigeonhole their vendors between routine vendors and critical vendors. Where I see it used the best is where salespeople and business development people use it to understand how they're being pigeonholed by their customers. And so look it up if you're interested. It's a great way to facilitate a dialogue internally about where you fit as a vendor in some of your customers' view. these are a little bit blurred out because I didn't want to show you exactly what was going on, because these are real life recent examples. The one on the left was a gold mining company. They just had a whole bunch of ways that they wanted to grow. They had a ton of opportunities to grow, and they wanted to be able to prioritize them better. You can see how simple this is. We put risk on the vertical scale. We put urgency from most urgent to least urgent on the horizontal scale. And we took each of those priorities, and I forced a conversation that the sticky notes can't be on top of each other. So every single one needs to be a little bit more risky or a little bit more urgent than every other single one. So did it give them the answer and say, ta-da, these are our priorities? No, but it gave them a great way to have the conversation. And by the way, you can pick any scale you want, whatever works for you, but it gave them a great way to have the conversation to say, where do we want some things that are lower risk, but more urgent, versus some things that are high risk and maybe less urgent. And you can see that there's this kind of pattern, and that quite often happens anytime you do a prioritization exercise. There's this kind of pattern that goes from low risk, low urgency to high risk, high urgency, and not a lot of stuff on the outsides. So they were able to draw out and pull out some things that were obvious to them. But all it did, in this case, it was with a board of directors. These are high level priorities with a board of directors. All it did was gave them a mechanism to have this prioritization discussion. In this case, at a very high level, but you can do this with your kids about, what you're going to do on your holiday. I mean, you can use that for just about anything. All right, Caitlin, next poll. As an organization, our actions and projects are tightly aligned to our strategy. At the very top of the scale, yes, more than 80% of our project and strategy execution resources are dedicated to the execution of a clear, well understood strategy. To the bottom of the poll of what? We have a strategy? All right, so we'll give you a minute to think about that. I don't know if you watch the debaters or listen to the debaters ever, but I guess my polls are half funny and half fact. All right, so we're at the top of the spectrum, which is nice. Probably the single most important thing in an organization in terms of strategy execution is that we can look back and say the time, money, effort, resources we're investing are actually aligned to our strategy. It's very unusual for me to go into an organization and especially start talking to people 1 or 2 levels down. And usually the answer is, I'm busting my butt, I'm killing it on a project, I'm doing my best effort, and so is the person next to me, but I'm not sure if we're actually working in the same direction. I'm not sure if the project's actions, day-to-day efforts and resource expenditures that we're making are actually aligned to the overall strategic direction of this organization. And that's a horrible feeling for people to have. And it's horrible for a company to not be sure that their resources are clearly aligned to the strategic direction. One of the easiest things that we can do is, back to that Oxford Dictionary definition, is we can bring a new part of the definition to prioritization, which is to help us distinguish between what's urgent and what's important when we make prioritization decisions. The reason that we're lousy at prioritization, the single most important reason, is because humans feel bad about their priority not making the list. This is why we struggle to prioritize in organizations, because for something to be prioritized, something else has to be deprioritized. And unfortunately, and I see this, I call it the brick wall moment in a lot of my engagements with customers, there's a moment in every strategy development process where we're making tough decisions about what's really going to get done and what's really not going to get done, where human emotion enters the picture, and where prioritization decisions are being driven because people don't want to see their thing, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, their thing not make the list of what's going to get effort, resources, and management attention. We ultimately correlate self-worth with our priorities. We ultimately correlate self-worth with our ideas being executed. What I'd like you to try and do is to break the barrier, to use a new framing of the discussion to remove that barrier and say, all of our ideas are important. All of our opportunities are important. All of our growth drivers are important. But in the context of today's strategy, today's operating environment, today's competitive environment, what's most important in that context and what's truly urgent. One of the easiest ways to do this is just to facilitate a discussion in your own head or with the folks that you work with to distinguish between what's important and what's urgent based on today's context. And so when you're prioritizing a group of things, you can try framing the question, the discussion like this. All of the options under consideration are important, and any one of them could be a valid choice. But given our current strategy, which of the options that we're looking at are likely most urgent? Which of these things should be tackled now because they're foundational for execution or to open up other options in the future? Which of these options are really important but less urgent given the current situation? Which of these options could be more easily postponed from a timing perspective with the least risk? And given our current situation, which of these things is truly imperative? So when you start with a laundry list of opportunities, try to pull the top stuff to the top and the bottom stuff to the bottom. And the bottom stuff, you've got to frame it that the bottom stuff doesn't mean your ideas stink. The bottom stuff just simply means, given the context, given where we're going, given the foundation we want to build, what's most urgent for prioritization today, what's least urgent for prioritization today. This really takes the pressure off us from that kind of human and emotional perspective. But we all know the interesting thing is that when we deprioritize based on urgency, those priorities quite often never make the cut in the future either. Sometimes they do, but times change, things change, and we actually find out that those priorities were in fact less important, but we're actually just framing the conversation around importance given the current situation and urgency. The other thing that I've learned the hard way over the years is that no amount of decision criteria, no amount of having the tools, tips, and tricks that I'm talking about today in terms of having a prioritization process, no amount of theory in terms of how we prioritize, no amount of powerful strategic direction about where we're going to focus our efforts on growth, on efficiencies, on expansion, on excellence, whatever it is that we're doing in our strategy, no amount of that helps if we have messy buildup left over from prior periods of lousy prioritization. The example that I've got on the screen is the example that I alluded to before. One of my very first aha moments with this was with a company who I still work with many years later and who I can see longitudinally where they're at. They did a great job to set the strategic direction of their organization very specifically. They did a great, and specifically, measurably, tangibly, without getting tactical. They did a great job taking that down one level to say, okay, if that's where we want to be in 5 years, what are the 5 most important things, these things that are actually imperative for us to accomplish in the next 12 to 18 months, our strategic imperatives? They did a great job with that. And then they hit this brick wall where everybody said, this is great. We have the strategic direction. We know where we want to go. And then I said, how do we align all of our projects to those 5 things? They said, well, it should be easy. We'll just come up with the 5 projects. And I said, but what are people working on today? How many projects do you have going on in your organization today? So to give you context, it's about 2,000 employees, somewhere around $1 billion in sales. So not a huge company, but not a small company either. And they had 325 projects, serious projects, like projects that we could actually list out and inventory. And when I went around and talked to people about the 325 projects on that list, they were crushing, demoralizing, debilitating. Most of the projects had been on that list for a very long time. Most of the projects people had picked up and set down. Maybe they got together to talk about it, maybe they didn't. and very little progress was being made on most of the 325 projects on that list. And we had to clean up the messy buildup. We had to eliminate most of the projects on the list, and we had to get it down to 40. Working with this company now after many years, they actually have a rule in their organization, which is 25 projects, what they call a level 1, level 2 project, not a whole little stuff, but 25 projects at any one time, period. That's the rule. And they never launch, they have a nice process to bring those projects on stream, and they never launch a new project until they get down to 24. And they found as an organization that they are most effective in executing their strategy. They are most effective in not burning their people out. They are most effective in being able to have enough senior sponsorship of those projects, because there's only 5 or 8 or 9 people on the senior leadership team for the highest level projects, when they only have 25 projects in their project portfolio at that level, and level 1 and level 2. The other example I would use is I helped another organization with their SAP issues list. And they had a process, their IT department had a process to take in issues for people who across the organization were struggling with something that needed to be changed, reprogrammed, fixed, tweaked, bugged within their enterprise resource management system. And we came up with a great process for getting things into the pipeline, a great process for people to understand the progress of where their request was in the process. But what we found out is with 2,000 requests, old, crappy, outdated, misunderstood requests in process, they were still paralyzed. And so we had to essentially create a few business rules to say, if it hasn't been touched in a year, it's gone. If it doesn't have a sponsor, it's gone, whatever. And we basically wiped out that list and allowed people to restart with a fresh start. And it was the only way for that quite amazing prioritization process to really work. So no amount of smart, clever, brutal prioritization will really help if you're carrying around a lot of messy buildup from prior processes. All right, Caitlin, next poll. We have clear mechanisms and accountabilities in our company to evaluate and rationalize programs and services. So we have a mechanism today to clean up messy buildup and to prevent messy buildup from happening from a priority perspective. This is probably the single least fun thing that you can do in a company, is wipe out lists of priorities that have been hanging around too long. All right, and the survey says, yeah, so none of us are at the top where we don't have messy buildup and we've got a really formal way of keeping on top of it. But most of us are somewhere in that place where, yeah, but we could do more to rationalize. We could do some spring cleaning. We don't have formal mechanisms, but we do try to stay on top of it. All right, next question. We have formal mechanisms to open us up to our next conversation. We have formal mechanisms where we have a formal mechanism for making strategic decisions. True or false? Caitlin can get the questions up faster than I can say them. All right, and the survey says, yeah, most of us have something. 3/4 have some kind of formal mechanism for making decisions, which is good. And I hope I help you with that a little bit today. The other thing that's come to me over the years, and although it's a tough thing to do, it's an adult grown-up thing to do to help us prioritize, which is to provoke a response about prioritization early, to be more specific about what prioritization looks like, to not be vague about what we're asking for in terms of prioritization. In fact, to take it to a level where we're being fairly provocative early in the process to elicit a response earlier, so that we don't find out later that we've got misalignment around what our priorities are, that we've got disagreement about where we should be investing our time, money, effort, and resources. It's about having the tough conversations and provoking that response a little bit earlier. It's not about being confrontational. It's just about trying to make sure that we're on the same page with our colleagues and trying to find out a little bit earlier in the process. So I'll give you a simple example. We've got a project. It's an important strategic project, and we're going to build a new system, a new CRM system, something big and ugly. We're going to build a new CRM system in our organization. And the project manager has done a great job. They've held strategy sessions. They've made sure that they know the business requirements. They've made sure they know what they want to get out of the said system. They've made sure that they understand exactly what's in and out of scope. And they've gone around the organization and they've talked to all kinds of people to make sure the scope of this thing doesn't get carried away, and to make sure that they prioritize effectively, but still deliver the business outcomes that they're being asked to deliver. And this project manager is provocative in their prioritization. And so they've got some concerns. And so when they got together with the project team, they listed out some of the risks that they might face, particularly where they would have pressure, specific pressures on their scope. And so rather than just saying what's in scope and what's out of scope, they said what's out of scope and where will we specifically have pressures to put some of these things back in scope? Where specifically will we face pressure when this project starts and during the project execution, where we will face specific challenges, specific pressures to increase our scope after the project's already started? And they identified this guy, Bob. And Bob is a guy who's been talking about, building a certain kind of system in the organization for many years. You could call it his pet project. And you could say that no matter what, Bob always tries to get this pet project done in the context of just about anything that's happening in the organization. And in fact, this is probably a good argument for Bob. He's going to make the argument that while we have the hood open on the CRM system, why the heck aren't we doing this pet project that I've been asking for years? So the project manager takes the first step and they say, here's what's out of scope. What Bob's been asking for is Bob's been asking for a automated call system. And Bob thinks this is really important. And so as the project manager, I'm going to put the automated call system out of scope. I'm going to very clearly describe what the automated call system is. And I'm going to say that this is not in the scope of this project. We don't have the time, money, effort, or resources to execute the audit or to build the automated call system in the scope of this project. Good start. Then the project manager goes one step further and they have a meeting with Bob and they go and say, hey, Bob, I know you've been talking about this automated call system for quite some time, and I'm sure it's very important to you. I just want to clarify between you and I, before I get project approval, that the automated call system is not in scope of the CRM project. Just want to make sure. And so Bob could either say, yeah, I totally agree, or no, I think that's totally nonsense, and I'm going to fight for this in this project because I think it makes sense. And then the project manager takes it one step further, and in their project approval presentation, they list out where they will feel pressure on their scope to increase their scope in the future. And they say, I went and provoked a response from Bob, and we agreed that this will not be part of the CRM project. Or Bob still thinks that it should be part of the CRM project, but hey, approvers, I'm looking for you for approval that we will execute this project without this specific piece of scope. So this is kind of a long-winded story to say, we need to be adult, we need to be grown up, we need to do not do what we usually do, which is we all know that Bob wants that thing, and maybe we'll list it out of scope, but we won't provoke a response. We won't be provocative about it. We won't cause a fight now. But the truth is, I guess all I'm saying is it's much more important to cause the fight now than later. It's much more important to find out and have everybody with full intention and full eyes open agree to what our priorities are downstream, then find out once we're already executing that in fact we're still having the same fight. The other thing, of course, is that project manager would be less happy, but they would be happier if the approver said, you know what? This is the time to do the automated call system. This is part of your scope, because then the project manager can say, great, so then approve my project based on the increased time, the increased cost, the increased risk, and the increased complexity by which this project will occur. And then we're still good. So we still know what our priorities are, and we're not going to find out later that our priorities are shifting under our feet. I asked earlier about decision-making processes and in your organizations. One of the most powerful and easy things you can do is to apply decision criteria to decisions that your prioritization decisions that you're trying to make. It's kind of pointless to list out a bunch of projects or list out a bunch of things that you want to do on your vacation with categories of low, medium, and high priority if you don't know what the question is. So to prioritize something, you need the criteria by which you're going to prioritize those things. And it's very effective, very helpful, very, again, grown up to set your decision criteria before you face the actual choice, without backing into it to get the answer that you want. You should always talk, you kind of know roughly what the ideas are that you're prioritizing, but you should always set your decision criteria and weight them before you actually start to apply them to the list of priorities. So you want to be able to have your decision criteria help you with questions like, what tests would a choice around a target market, an action, a project, what we're going to do on our vacation need to pass to tell us that something is a higher priority than something else? So what's the test that would tell us that this thing is a higher priority than this thing before we actually look at those two things? What criteria will apply to our choices to help us prioritize? Pretty simple question. Which rules should our winning choices satisfy? So what are those decision criteria? Here's some examples. I ask this question a lot with my clients, and they usually fall into two buckets. Usually, not always, but usually into these two buckets. One is there are usually some criteria around impact, and there are usually some criteria about ease or ease of execution. You can go online. I literally just have a spreadsheet where it has, I can plug in the names of the people so that everybody can make their own choice in a session. I can plug in the names of the decision. I can plug in the list of decision criteria, and I can weight those decision criteria. And although that sounds painful, it's helpful because each decision criteria, some are more important than others in our decision. And people can just literally vote on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 for each decision for each priority against each decision criteria. And then again, we get a score for each, but it doesn't say that's the answer. It's just one more way to facilitate the conversation. So usually what ends up getting plugged in, and I would say 4 or 5 decision criteria. You don't want 2 because then they're too big and they're too vague. And you don't want 10 because you'll find out that they're actually not that important when you ask people to weight them. So on the impact side, there's usually some criteria around impact on our top line or our bottom line or our competitive advantage or our market leadership. So something depending on what we're actually prioritizing. There's usually some decision criteria around the potential for differentiation. So we want this thing to really be different, to really be better, to really have value proposition, to really have competitive differentiation than another thing. So something will be prioritized more highly. This is really, in my view, another version of impact on our gross margin or bottom line, but it's a criteria that people throw out to me a lot. What's most innovative or most fashionable or believe it or not, most politically palatable. So depending on who I'm working with, people might say, even if this idea is going to deliver a better top line impact or competitive advantage than that idea, we want something that the board's going to like the best or that's going to be most politically palatable given today's circumstances. What ends up happening with that one, as it says on the slide, is that one usually gets weighted lowly anyway. Biggest impact on a particular direction, particular strategy. And then there's this whole category around, okay, we want things with the most impact on whatever, the business results, or if we're not for profit, on the impact we have on our mandate, on our clients. But we want things that are going to be closest to what we do today and easiest to execute and and fastest to execute. And so you usually end up with this bucket of decision criteria on that front. best fit with our current capabilities or our current resources or our current practices, most likely to be accepted by our customers or our board or our community, most foundational to other strategic choices or strategies. And this goes back to one of my questions before, which is, what of these things is actually really important to help us execute strategy in the future rather than trying to jump to future strategy? Lowest barriers to execution, easiest to define. Actually, this is a big one with my clients today. It's one thing to say, this will have a big impact, and the market size is biggest for this one, but what's going to be easiest to identify and easiest to measure that the impact is there? It's one thing to say that we've got a $5 billion market here. Well, we can't go after a $5 billion market. Where do we have the most easy to understand addressable market or addressable opportunity or addressable problem? So that seems to be a decision criteria that's popular these days. Is it's one thing to say it's big enough for us to go after, but it's another thing to say, but we can wrap our head around it and know whether we're having the outcomes we want to have. And at the bottom there, as I said, just go and Google decision matrix templates. There's tons of them online, and if you're interested, there's a local company called Expert. The software is called Expert Choice, and the guy's name is will come to me in a minute. Great people, and I'll give you that name at the end when it comes to me. But the software is called Expert Choice. They come in and they'll facilitate an entire discussion using quite a sophisticated software if you have a list of really important priorities to make and you want it to be done very formally, very slickly, and with real rigor. The other prioritization tool that's really important in companies, and this also works for not-for-profits as well, is to be very clear and very precise about where we want our growth to come from. And the reason I pull this one out is because this is an area that provides excellent downstream advice for people to prioritize in the organization. It is one of the best bridges between the high-level strategy that we're saying we want to achieve. We want X amount of growth. We want to be in these markets. We want to look like this in 5 years. This is a great bridge employing growth drivers to then, where are we spending our time, money, effort, and resources? What are our projects? What are our business development people doing? Where are we spending our marketing dollars, as an example? And I really love this one as a bridge, and it's really easy. If you want to grow as an organization from 100,000 to 120,000, or from 100 million to 120 million, or from this level of service in our community to that level of service in our community, you have to ask yourself a very simple question before you ask everybody else to go and prioritize. Where do we want most of that growth to come from? And the answer can't be everywhere. The answer can't be opportunistic growth, because that's a dumb answer. Opportunistic growth means we are unwilling to prioritize. Do you want your growth to come from deeper share of wallet, deeper penetration with your existing customers? Or do you want your growth to come from the acquisition of new customers? Do you want your growth to come from your existing jurisdictions? Or do you want your growth, most of your growth, to come from expanding into new jurisdictions? Do you want your growth to come organically or through acquisition? You have to set that strategic guidance so that other people can prioritize, and so that you can know if they're actually following the strategic direction of the organization. It's tough. We want to say we want our growth to come from everywhere, but we all know the simple truth, which is if we want our growth to come from everywhere, we're going to have a disjointed strategy, and we're going to have an unproductive use of our resources. We're going to confuse marketing people. We're going to confuse salespeople about where the real priority is, where they should really define those priorities. So it really provides a foundation where, for my clients who have done this well, people in the organization breathe a sigh of relief, but not everybody, because some people still want to go and chase a bunch of opportunities in other areas. But as I said, if you said, we want most of our growth to come from these specific areas, so we want 50% of our growth to come from our existing customers next year, and we see salespeople out acquiring hundreds of new customers, then we can ask them why. The final thing that I have on my list is something very tactical and tangible, which is to start with the strategy of your organization. This is basically a little bit of a to-do list on steroids. Start with the strategy of your organization, where you want to be, let's say in 3 years. I like 3 years. So let's say between now and 2025, set out what your strategic imperatives are as an organization in terms of the 4 or 5 critical things that we need to accomplish in the next 12 months. And then on the left, define, okay, within that context, given my role in the organization, based on where the organization is going to be in 3 years, based on what we need to accomplish in the next 12 months, very strategically, what are my personal objectives? What are the 3 things that I must accomplish in the next 90 days to do my part? And so if I've got a big team, my things might be an amalgamation of my teams. And if I'm an individual working in that system, my things will be very specific, tangible, practical, but big. And within those 90-day objectives, and that's kind of strategic, then we take our regular to-do list that we're so used to, and we say, what's all the stuff that I've got to do in the next 7 days? I sit down every Monday morning. I never do anything until I do this. And I take my list from the week before. I keep it in Microsoft OneNote. I take my list from the week before. I copy it over, the few things that I drag over. And I make sure that every week I include all the regular things that got to be done. I've got to get this webinar written. I've got to get these invoices out. I've got to do these proposals, and combine that with all the strategic things that I need to do to help myself achieve those personal objectives for the quarter. And so this is a simple trick that every week you can not only tick the things off your list, the to-do list, but you can make time every week to move your personal objectives forward that you believe are aligned to the strategic imperatives of your organization, that you believe are aligned to the vision of your organization. So it's a simple way to just tick the box, but make that strategic direction on an ongoing basis. Last word for today is prioritization is hard. Don't give up. Do it every day. Make sure that you are feeling some pain in prioritization. Otherwise, you probably still have too many things on your to-do list. All right, Caitlin, I did pretty well. It's 11:52. As I said before, don't hesitate to contact me. Don't hesitate to call me. Don't hesitate to send me an email. Got time for questions, Caitlin?
Thank you so much, Peter. That was fantastic. A lot of really useful information. I think I mean, here making notes as well.
And I told you I never take a breath. So there you go.
There you go. Well, like he said, if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box, Q&A. If you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you manually from my end. We'll just give them maybe a moment or two to see if there's any questions here.
Yeah, and if you've got specific questions about, hey, how do you do this? You know, I want to go and try this. Don't hesitate to ask, because it'll help the rest of us. And if you've even got specific comment about, you know, this sounds good, but it's not going to work in my organization because X, that'll also help the rest of us understand it a little bit better too. All right, maybe no questions.
Yeah, I think you did a fantastic job of covering a lot of information. So maybe it's just a matter of digesting said information, and they can reach out to you if they have any additional questions afterwards. So I want to thank you again for your time today, and everyone for attending. This session was recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can kind of look back on some of this all of the information that Peter presented today. But yes, thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks to everybody. Thanks to Cowan for sponsoring.